Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
And occasionally on this podcast, we're accused of going back a little further than our remit of 1945 onwards. But to kick off this week's episode, I wanted to go back much further still, to 1348, which was the year of the founding of the Order of the Garter, the most senior order of chivalry in Britain, which was founded by Edward III, and is today limited to just 24 knights or ladies companion. Very much the great and the good of society. And I mention that because Richard and I were very privileged this week to go to the installation service for the Order of the Garter at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, where 3 new knights were installed, one of them being Ian Duncan Burnett, the former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, another being Gus O'Donnell, or as we learned, he's actually called Augustine O'Donnell. I suppose that was probably obvious, really, but I'd never thought of it.
Well, it could be asparagus, like Gus the Cat in Cats.
So I suppose it could. The former Cabinet Secretary, and most importantly for our purposes, Peter Hennessy, who has been the Attlee Professor of Contemporary British History at Queen Mary, University of London, where Richard teaches and where I share an affiliation, who was also made a Knight of the Garter. Many listeners will know about Peter Hennessy. He is really one of the standout historians and commentators on the British Constitution of the last half century or so, and is also, certainly in the brief occasions when I've met him and by everybody's account, one of the nicest people you could meet. And it was a real honour to be there to see the service and to see Peter Hennessy admitted to it. One of the things that the Order of the Garter is famed for is the procession, which starts around the corner from St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and the knights sort of process into it. But we were inside the chapel in the nave, and so we just got to see them at the end of the procession. And some of the people who happened to walk past were the King and Queen, the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, but also from a more political side, Tony Blair, who was made a Knight of the Garter just a few years ago, John Major, Mervyn King, Valerie Amos, Cathy Ashton, people like Robin Butler as well, another former Cabinet Secretary, and some others. So it was a really special day, and we were very, very privileged to be able to go there. A couple of things I wanted to just start by mentioning about it that I thought might be a curiosity for listeners. One of them is that the famous procession and the annual event at Windsor is actually quite a modern tradition. So that was created really by George VI to mark an anniversary of the Order of the Garter, and it does not necessarily date back to the 14th century itself, although there has often been this historic connection to Windsor. But it hasn't consistently met at Windsor in the way that it does now every year. It is, some may say, an invented tradition, but all traditions are, to some degree, invented. The other thing that was really striking to me is as we look down the list of people who were members of the Order of the Garter, only 2 of them were not members of the House of Lords. And they, somewhat bizarrely, were the 2 former Prime Ministers, Sir John Major and Sir Tony Blair. Everybody else had a peerage. And this is particularly odd, I think, and particularly striking, because there was a time when the surest way to get a peerage, aside from inheriting one, which of course now no longer comes with any entitlement to sit in the House of Lords, although it does still bring the title itself. The surest way to get in the Lords used to be by being a Prime Minister. Prime Ministers were consistently made Earls and given positions in the House of Lords. That's how Harold Macmillan became the Earl of Stockton. That's how Stanley Baldwin became the Earl of Bewdley. And also Labour figures like Earl Attlee, Clement Attlee, how they ended up in the Lords. But the 2 Prime Ministers who served the longest to go, Major and Blair, have both declined to go into the House of Lords, a privilege which would undoubtedly be offered to them if they wanted to. And I don't think it's necessarily been reflected upon enough quite why they haven't chosen to do that. On that theme, though, of declining honours or turning things down that people may ordinarily be entitled to or may be offered, there is a bit of an association between the Order of the Garter itself, and particularly with Churchill, who in 1945, on the day when he resigned the premiership, having been defeated in the general election, was offered to become a Knight of the Order of the Garter. And a statement came out from Buckingham Palace which said, "After Mr. Churchill had tendered his resignation to the King last Thursday, His Majesty asked him to accept the Order of the Garter in recognition of his services throughout the war. Mr. Churchill, however, begged His Majesty that in the present circumstances he might be allowed to decline the offer." And this has become somewhat famed for Churchill saying, "Just after the British public had given me the Order of the Boot, I could hardly accept the Order of the Garter," because, of course, 1945, in spite of all that Churchill, the Conservative leader, had done in the war, was a landslide victory for Labour, and Churchill was ejected onto the opposition benches. At the time that Churchill was offered it, he was one of only 4 commoners to have been offered the status of the Order of the Garter. Now, it's rather worth saying that the word commoner there doesn't necessarily mean what people might think it does. It's simply saying that it's somebody without a peerage, and so who isn't part of the aristocracy, either created for themselves or inherited. So up until that point, the 4 commoners who had been offered it had all accepted it, and they were Sir Robert Walpole, Edward Grey, Arthur Balfour, and most recently Sir Austin Chamberlain. Other people who had started their lives as commoners, although not necessarily as commoners, had been given the Garter as well, but only at the time that they had already accepted some peerage. So Stanley Baldwin, for example, was a Knight of the Garter, but by the time he was given it, he had become an Earl. Churchill himself did eventually accept it, and accepted it as a commoner. He never took a peerage himself, but he didn't accept it until 1953, by which time he was Prime Minister again. This created a slightly odd precedent, with other people turning down the Garter later on. So most notably, Harold Macmillan turned down the Order of the Garter. Part of his rationale for doing so was that he thought it should only really be given out for service in war. But it's also suggested that what Macmillan really wanted was a different honour, which is the Order of Merit, which is a personal gift of the sovereign. And the suggestion for why Macmillan wanted to be OM rather than KG is that the Order of Merit was the one that both David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, 2 of the great heroes in Macmillan's political life, had been given. But Elizabeth II made Macmillan wait a little while before making him an OM. He finally got that in 1976. He never got the Garter, and the other honour and privilege that Elizabeth II offered him, to become an Earl, he declined in 1964, but finally accepted in the 1980s, when he became the Earl of Stockton on his 90th birthday. So there's some history of Prime Ministers being somewhat tricky about accepting honours and the timing and quite exactly what honours they want to have. But no suggestion, I think, this week that any of the new members of the Order of the Garter were anything but delighted to be appointed.
Yes, it was a wonderful day. It happened to be my birthday as well, which made it extra special. I must thank our friend Mark Scott, who's the Somerset Herald in the Royal College of Arms, for making it possible for us. And it was wonderful to spend the day with some fellow Queen Mary colleagues like Tom Chidwick, who has been a guest on this podcast talking about his research on Dick Taverne and British politics in the 1970s, and Nigel Fletcher, who's a fellow of the Mile-End Institute at Queen Mary as well, and other luminaries of the British Constitution like David Torrance and others. It's a great day for people spotting. In addition to the names that Lee mentioned, I think actually probably the greatest delight for me was to see Cherie Blair. I've never seen her in the flesh before. And what I liked about seeing Cherie Blair was, as we were all sat in the nave waiting for the procession to begin, and everyone's sort of nervous energy is anticipation of the procession coming down the line, Cherie Blair is darting about, I don't know, looked like she was sort of issuing instructions to various yeoman guards or beefeaters or whatever they are in their finery, and hobnobbing with members of the audience and blowing kisses to people and waving at people that she recognised in the audience and hugging people and so on. I didn't see any of the other spouses of the knights do that. I can't say I can really picture Norma Major behaving in quite the same way, nor could I picture, say, Peter Kellner, the pollster and husband of Baroness Ashton, quite doing the same. But it was quite fun watching her do all that. A colleague of mine, who's a fellow Labour supporter, made the comment to me afterwards, "I hope you enjoyed your day celebrating an archaic feudal hangover." And it got me thinking, well, what has been the attitude of the Labour Party to the Order of the Garter? And I have to say that although I suppose there are people in the Labour Party who have a problem with the Order of the Garter, some of the most significant figures in Labour's history certainly have had no problem with the Order of the Garter and have been very happy to be a part of it. And it got me thinking about those members of the Labour Party who were also members of the Garter. And there are some quite interesting examples. If you look first at the Labour Prime Ministers, 4 Labour Prime Ministers have been members of the Order of the Garter: Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, and Tony Blair. And in fact, of the other Labour Prime Ministers, one might imagine that Ramsay MacDonald, who of course left the Labour Party but was the first Labour Prime Minister, had he not died, he probably would have been offered the Order of the Thistle, which is the highest order of chivalry in Scotland. So I don't think he really would have been in the running for the Garter, not for ideological objections, but because he's Scottish, and often Scottish figures prefer to be part of the Order of the Thistle rather than the Order of the Garter, because the Order of the Garter is an English chivalric honour. It's part of the honour of St. George, of course, the patron saint of England. And likewise, Gordon Brown hasn't taken the Garter, he hasn't really taken any honours, and that may be for ideological reasons, but also, I think if he were to take a chivalric honour, again, it would be the Thistle rather than the Garter. And of course, Sir Keir Starmer, already has a knighthood, although not as a member of the Garter. Who knows what will happen to him? But at the moment, of course, he's still the Prime Minister. So the way I look at it, every Labour Prime Minister who was eligible for the Garter, in the fact that they were an English Prime Minister, has taken it. So it can't be that objectionable from a Labour perspective. And then I looked back at other people from Labour history who took the order, and they're very interesting figures. So the first Labour politician to be made a Knight of the Garter was the first Viscount Addison, who was made a member of the Garter in 1947, so actually after Churchill was first offered it. And Addison is an interesting figure. He was the son of a farmer whose parents supported him to get a good education, and he went on to become a surgeon and became a very, very distinguished and effective surgeon. And as I understand it, there are still elements of medical scholarship that are still indebted to Addison. And then he made his foray into politics, motivated by his belief in expanding the access of the poor to get good quality healthcare. He started his career as a Liberal, but we won't hold that against him. And in 1922, he converted to the Labour Party and became a very distinguished Labour MP for Swindon, not far from where we live now. And Addison eventually was made a peer, a Viscount, by Clement Attlee, and was Labour's leader in the House of Lords in the first Labour government. And Addison played a really important role in that government because in those days, of course, the entirety of the House of Lords was hereditary. There were no life peers, and they were overwhelmingly conservative. There was a tiny minority of hereditary Labour peers, but partly thanks to the fact that the House of Commons had by that point asserted its primacy over the House of Lords, but also due to the skill of Addison and his good relationship with the Marquess of Salisbury, who was the Conservative leader at the time. A convention was established, which we still abide by today, the Salisbury Convention, which accepted that if the Labour government had been elected on Socialist Manifesto promises, that the Labour government should be entitled to successfully legislate for those Socialist Manifesto promises, even if the Conservatives in the House of Lords didn't personally like them. Really, really important work that Addison did. So I think he was a very, very deserving first Labour member of the Order of the Garter. And then throughout the 20th century, there are other interesting figures who get the Garter. A.V. Alexander, the first Earl Alexander, was made a Knight of the Garter in 1964. Alexander was a working class Labour politician. He was the son of a blacksmith who left school at 13 and started his working life as a salesman and clerk. He had a very distinguished career as a politician. He served as the first Lord of the Admiralty under three different prime ministers, Ramsay MacDonald, Winston Churchill, and Clement Attlee. And he was also Clement Attlee's Minister of Defence, then became Labour leader in the Lords when Viscount Addison, for health reasons, had to stand down. So I think he was also a very worthy choice. And there are other interesting people who got the Garter from the Labour perspective in the rest of the 20th century. The Earl of Longford, a very long-serving figure in the Labour Party, a minister under both Attlee and Wilson, and a champion of various causes, some better than others, I would have to say. The Lord Rhodes, the Lord Shackleton. And in the 21st century, various Labour figures have continued to accept the Garter. Lord Morris of Aberavon, a Welsh Labour figure who was, I believe, the last living member of the Wilson cabinet. He took the Garter in the early 21st century. And in addition to Tony Blair at the moment, you have two other Labour figures who are ladies of the Garter, Baroness Amos and Baroness Ashton, who was a European Union political figure, but came from the Labour perspective. So actually, the Garter may be an archaic feudal hangover, but it has been seen as one that various socialists for the last 80 years have felt comfortable being a part of. And actually, I think it's really important for Labour figures who have had distinguished careers in public life to accept this honour, because it cements the Labour Party's relationship with the Crown, which I think is strategically as well as historically a very good thing for the Labour Party to do. And it recognises the service that Labour politicians have given to this country. And if the Labour Party were just to say, well, we're not going to take part in these things because they were formulated in the 14th century when the common people of the country didn't have access to them, I understand that perspective, but I think that it is somewhat of a self-defeating perspective, and it marginalises the central contribution that the Labour Party has made to this country in the last 100 years. Being a member of the Garter was good enough for great Labour figures like Clement Attlee and Harold Wilson, or for working class Labour politicians like Viscount Addison and A.V. Alexander, then I don't think that we should be too sniffy about it today.
Well, the idea of a hangover, of course, implies something unwanted caused by the indulgences of the past, which I dare say is how some people think of the honours system. But also, hangovers can be a reminder of jolly times in the past too, and that's rather how I see them and how I see traditions. And happily, I think of them as not coming, in fact, with the pains of a hangover, but instead as being things of joy, really, that are passed from one generation to the next. And I think this tradition has, of course, evolved a huge amount that spans the centuries. Is actually a very nice one. I mean, one of the ways in which it's evolved is that as we all sat there in an Anglican chapel in Windsor, two of the three people who were being admitted to the Garter were Catholics, Peter Hennessy and Gus O'Donnell. I don't know about Lord Burnet's denomination or religion, but certainly at least two of them are known as being Catholic or from Catholic backgrounds. And whilst some people may think pejoratively of these things, my general view is that many of the great European nations, in fact, carry on not just with monarchies, but with these orders of chivalry and with these traditions. The Danes have their Order of the Elephant and so on. And so when I think people on the left sometimes see these as being anachronisms of the British state, in fact, they could embrace them as being some of the hallmarks of European social democracies instead, and rather nice things too. As you spoke about some of the Labour figures and their relationship to the Garter, I thought I'd add a few more bits to the story on the Conservative side. Margaret Thatcher was made a Lady of the Garter in 1995. Edward Heath had the Garter too. Working back through Tory leaders, Alec Douglas-Home didn't, but for the reason that he was Scottish and was a Knight of the Thistle. And in fact, if you ever go to the New Club in Edinburgh, you can see this tremendous portrait of Alec Douglas-Home wearing the robes of the Order of the Thistle, these great green robes, as opposed to the deep blue robes that the Garter wears. I mentioned Macmillan didn't have it, but Anthony Eden, his predecessor, did, and Churchill, of course, as I mentioned, did from 1953. The Finnish Neville Chamberlain didn't take the Order of the Garter, but he was offered it at the very, very end of his life and the end of his political career. But he turned it down, apparently saying that he would like to die as just plain old Mr. Chamberlain, rather like his father, Joseph Chamberlain, which is just one of the many oddities and quirks about the Chamberlain family, that really the two most consequential Chamberlains, Joseph Chamberlain and Neville Chamberlain, died without any honours at all, and Austen Chamberlain, the one who was still a very prominent politician, the one who was groomed in many ways by his father to be the great politician in the family, was the only one to get the Garter himself. Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
My matter of interest this week are BCRs, benefit to cost ratios, but don't switch off the podcast quite yet. One of the problems I see in British politics today is that it feels stuck. We have this Labour government that has been elected with an enormous majority. We have this extremely flexible constitution with parliamentary sovereignty. We're outside of the European Union now. The idea that whatever Parliament legislates ipso facto is constitutional is operational in our system right now. The government could legislate for whatever it wants to legislate. And yet it feels like what the government is doing is very minimalistic, very piecemeal, lacking vision, lacking boldness, lacking strength. And I compare that to the sense of kinetic energy that flowed from the Attlee government after the Second World War. You know, in the first just 12 months of that government, the legislation to nationalise the mines, nationalise the Bank of England were passed. Within the first 18 months, the legislation to create the National Health Service was passed. The massive expansion of the welfare state through various national insurance acts was passed. And the creation of completely new towns was also passed. All of that legislation happened in the first 18 months. And we are now approaching, next month, the 2-year anniversary of the Starmer Labour government. And really, what can this government point to of equal boldness and equal measure? Very little. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. But one of the reasons, I think, is about how we do government today, how we actually make decisions about big projects as a state. The other week, I went to an economics course in Whitehall called Economics for Policymaking. And it was geared at people who worked in and around politics. So many of the people there were civil servants or lobbyists or people who ran their own foundations or charities, but interacted with the government in some way. I think I was the only academic who attended. One of our tutors on this course was a now retired but long-standing civil servant in the Department for Transport, who was talking to us about how big infrastructure projects are decided. And he introduced us to something called the Green Book, which those of you who listen who work in government may be familiar with. Its formal title is the Central Government Guidance on Appraisal and Evaluation. And he was saying that if you want to implement a big infrastructure project in Britain, there are 5 business cases that the project needs, according to this Green Book. A strategic case, an economic case, a financial case, a commercial case, and a management case. But he said in practice, there's only one case that really matters, and that's the economic case. And in fact, in the economic case, there's only one number that matters in the whole document, which could be thousands and thousands of words, and that is the BCR, the benefits to cost ratio. A project plan could have hundreds of pages, but civil servants will Control F to the BCR to find this one number to determine whether or not the project goes ahead. BCR is benefits over costs. So simplistically, If a project costs £100 million but is expected to generate £300 million in value, then the BCR is 3.0, which according to the civil service is a very high value BCR. And the scale of the BCR is if you have a BCR of 0 to 1, that's poor, 1 to 1.5 is low, 1.5 to 2 is medium, 2 to 4 is high, and anything above 4 is very high. And this civil servant said that in practice, what he tried to aim for infrastructure projects was a project to have a BCR of 2.16 or higher. He thought that would tend to get Treasury sign-off. Now, of course, the crucial thing with a cost to benefit ratio is how are the benefits calculated. Now, I'm pleased to say it's not just in terms of revenue for the government. So it's not just tax intake from higher economic activity. And there has been an effort to incorporate what are determined to be kind of social benefits from the BCR. So this includes productivity gains, reduced pressure on public services, reduction in crime, improvement in health, increase private sector activity like building houses, employment, and net zero targets like reduction in carbon. In order to factor these things into this number, the BCR, of course, a value, an actual value, has to be attached to these things. And so there are teams of civil servants who work out what is the monetary benefit of people living in a cleaner environment for, let's say, savings for the health service over a 60-year time horizon, or what are the benefits in terms of the reduction of policing costs if you have teenagers going to some kind of youth club rather than fighting each other in the streets, or whatever it might be. I still have huge problems with government by BCR after this. I was not satisfied at all by this, and these are my big objections. The first is a moral or communitarian, or maybe it's a socialist objection. It comes from my kind of starting principles in politics. There are some things that just cannot be monetized. I don't care how many proxies you develop with very clever people. There are some things that are beyond the market and beyond price mechanisms. And any attempt, I think, to put value on them in this numerical sense is specious. How can you put a price on pride? How can you put a price on dignity, or heritage, or happiness, or patriotism, or friendship? You can try, but in doing so, it deforms those particular aspirations and goals, which I think are very, very important aspirations and goals for our society. It instrumentalizes pretty much everything we do. A rural bus route may not deliver economic benefits, but if it allows some elderly people to be able to get the bus to see some of their friends in the neighboring village so that they can have a coffee together on a Tuesday, well, maybe that's still a worthwhile goal of the state. Or if you give a subsidy to keep a steelworks open, maybe it has a BCR below 2.16. But can you really put a price on the dignity of labor that might provide for those who work in that factory, whose parents have worked in that factory, who may not be able to get jobs of equivalent social or economic standing if that factory were to close? If you set up a library and you find its BCR is under 2, but it enables a child who perhaps lives in an overcrowded house in a town where they have many siblings, maybe it's a chaotic family life, maybe things aren't very nice at home, and it gives them a refuge and a space from that. How really can you put a value on that? Really, should we even be trying to put a value on that sort of thing? And so what I think is a big problem with the BCR is it encourages this kind of small-minded, technocratic, instrumentalized view of the state, rather than bold, visionary statecraft, or just statecraft that comes from first principles. What are the moral objectives of government? What type of society does government actually want to create? And in this course that I took, there was a very good question from someone who I think was Italian. And they said, hang on a second, not every country uses BCR to establish government spending commitments and projects. France does not use BCR when it sets up nuclear power stations. It sets up nuclear power stations because it believes it's important for France to have energy independence. China does not use BCR when it builds its high-speed rail. It builds high-speed rail because it wants the country of China to be interconnected. And it has a goal of creating a national identity and diminishing regional and separatist identities. And this civil servant, who was very good and very interesting, replied and said, well, that may be true, but Britain is really admired around the world for using the BCR. And we get a lot of respect from other countries for the fact that we govern by BCR. And I thought, do we get respect from the ordinary people of these countries? Or do we just get respect from the business elite and the political elite of those countries? And if we do, who cares? I don't really want their respect, to be honest. I mean, if we get it, it's nice to have. But I don't think that we should be making our governing decisions on that basis. And then finally, what you end up seeing, from what I gather in this discussion, and I'm sure civil servants who listen to this may have a more rounded perspective than I do on this. It seems to me that if you want a project to happen, what ends up taking place is that civil servants start tinkering with these valuations of the social value of these projects to be able to improve the BCR so you get over the 2.0 or 2.16 or 3.0 threshold. Whereas I would just prefer, if ministers think it's a good project, just do it. Just back the project and say, we believe in this project. Because the BCR is not a real number. I mean, it is a number. It looks very precise and technical. But actually, it's just based on these made-up numbers about what is the social value of X or Y or Z. And you can come up with all kinds of technical estimations, but that's all they are. And so it's a highly deceptive form of policy making. And it's another way in which British politics has removed political accountability in exchange for technical process. And I think we've been much the worst country for it.
Well, that's quite a change of theme. But it's interesting, though, because I think for me, things like cost-benefit ratios are useful to know, but clearly very limited in terms of what they can tell us. And they ought not be the driving motivation of government decision-making. You know, government is not, or certainly should not, be a spreadsheet exercise. There has to be something more to it than that. And attempts to reduce government down to reports and spreadsheet exercises may in some sense feel like, oh, the process is better, this is more rigorous, etc. But, you know, we've had this for quite a while, really, and I don't think anybody really thinks that government by this is serving us particularly well. I'll do some defences maybe of why I think these ratios can be useful to know, but then some criticisms too. One of the reasons why I think it's useful to know is that to some degree we do want to stop, or we do want to at least have the tools to scrutinise and prevent government from pursuing fruitless vanity projects, as opposed to things where it's taking a noble but perhaps a low cost-benefit ratio punt on a project that they think is of some wider benefit to the country. Now, we don't really want politicians to just pursue all their vanity projects without any real sense of the value that could be attributed to them. I rather think about this in the way that I rather think about the way in which the government relates to the OBR, or the Office for Budget Responsibility. Generally speaking, I think the OBR is a useful thing to have because it can give a view of certain economic analysis of government decision-making and the wider economic picture. but it ought not be what determines what policy is. Governments ought to be able to and be willing to argue and stand up to what the OBR says. And as it happens, George Osborne, who created it, did do that on occasions, whereas it's Rachel Reeves who has arguably made it rather more sacrosanct. And I think something the same about this, that it's useful to know and it can be helpful in decision making, but it ought not be what determines the decision. Politicians ought to be able to argue for low cost benefit ratio projects if they think there's wider value to them. That being said, the other reason why I'm sure some people think it is valuable is that there is a view, an accurate view in some respects, that this country is not as prosperous and not as rich as it ought to be, and that to invest in low cost benefit ratio projects, certainly if that ratio is below 1, is simply to use government money to make us poorer. And we ought to have the numbers to know that that is what we're doing and to argue against it and to avoid it. But the reason why I generally take your view on this is that, well, clearly the number is flawed in plenty of respects. For example, if you take cost, well, you can have a snapshot and a projection of what the cost is at any particular time, but of course it isn't fixed. The cost-benefit ratio of HS2 will have been very different when the project was first announced than it is today, because the costs have totally skyrocketed in a way that appears to have been uncontrolled. Similarly, this number can tell you different things at different times and be of less value at some times than others. For example, if you have at one stage a really good cost-benefit ratio and you say, yes, gosh, we've got to really go for that project, it's going to produce enormous returns. Well, let's say the costs go up, or that ratio changes for some other reason, but then you've got all this sunk cost and all this investment that goes into it, at which point you may say, well, the cost-benefit ratio has dropped, but it's now still worth doing because we've already spent X billion pounds on it, and we don't want to lose that investment. So at that stage, the question would be somewhat different. But the bigger reason why I think we shouldn't obsess around these numbers is really the one that you made, that there are other things that are valuable about what government does rather than just economic return. Levelling up is a worthwhile thing to do on social and moral grounds, not just economic grounds. We should be investing much more in creating more growth and prosperity in all parts of the country, not just because it's economically good, but because of a wider benefits too. People living lives of decency and dignity is also important, irrespective of the economic side of it. The preservation of heritage, the creation of more community value for people, security, like you said, both energy security, but also defence as well. All of these things matter and are worth pursuing, irrespective of whether or not they feel like good financial bets. And the final thing I wanted to say on this, and actually I'd apply this to all sorts of government spending, not just infrastructure projects, is that there is a general culture in government, but also beyond, of focusing decision-making on things that we can quantify and measure, where there is some ability to predict what the benefits may or may not be, and also where we can attribute the decisions that we make to those similarly measurable and quantifiable outcomes. And this is just such a narrow way of thinking, really, about decision-making, sometimes because there are things where it may be really hard to predict them. Let's take example, it's not related to infrastructure. Let's talk about, say, investing in music in schools. We were having a conversation with somebody just the other day on this theme. You cannot easily calculate what the economic advantages might be of music in schools. It could be that all you have is some people who are jobbing musicians throughout their career, and that produces some economic value. It could be that the person who you were to provide music lessons to ends up becoming Elton John and paying hundreds of millions of pounds in tax revenue. You can't easily predict that. But you know what? It might be worth having a gamble on it anyway, that you can produce as a country like the UK that is very rich culturally and is a great export of culture around the world. It might be worth gambling on having more Elton Johns and more Adeles by investing in music in schools, even though you can't fully predict that. And it might be a dud bet in economic terms, because even if it is that, well, there is still moral and cultural and social value in having invested in music in schools too.
Yeah, so I see the point of there being some degree of calculation as to what the costs of projects will be, and some form of evaluating the costs and the benefits is itself not a bad thing. for civil service to do. What I think is a bad thing is the fetishization of this particular ratio, as if it's some kind of precise, immovable figure that ultimately those calculations, I think, can only be a guide for part of a much bigger decision-making process. And rather than focus too much on these economic questions, even with the integration of the social benefits that BCR today is said to take in, there are still even wider considerations than the BCR can ever possibly take into account. You mention the risk of politicians pursuing fruitless vanity projects. And look, of course, there is a risk in that. But my view is that rather than politicians bind themselves in advance through these technocratic mechanisms, that we should see that politicians are held to account by the public. If you have a government that wastes public money on fruitless vanity projects, then you should have confidence that the British public will respond to that government by voting them out. And if they don't vote them out, then ultimately the public is consenting to the use of those funds for that purpose. And who's then to say that those are, in fact, fruitless vanity projects? During this course, the tutor made the point about the need not to waste public money. But I sort of sat there thinking, well, okay, I understand that, but what does it mean to waste public money? And if the public gives their support for a particular enterprise, then is it really a waste of public money, even if it doesn't generate objective, quote unquote, economic benefits? He gave the example in the lecture of the Humber Bridge, this bridge which goes up over the Humber estuary connecting Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. And approval for the Humber Bridge came in January 1966 by the Transport Minister Barbara Castle, just days before the Hull North by-election, which by no coincidence was one of the towns which would be connected through this bridge. Now, the Humber Bridge took a long time to build, and it didn't open until 1981, so a long time after this by-election had been concluded. And the Humber Bridge was a great marvel of British engineering. At the time that it was built, it was the longest single-span suspension bridge in the world, and it continued to hold that title for another 17 years until one was built in Japan in the late 90s that finally overtook it. Now, you can look at the Humber Bridge and say, well, was it really necessary? People could drive around the Humber estuary. The idea that there was this kind of economic activity between this bit of Yorkshire and this bit of Lincolnshire wasn't so obvious. On the other hand, it's a great achievement of our country to have built this bridge that nowhere else in the world had built a bridge of its kind before and for many years afterwards. And for the people who did live on either side of the bridge, it did make a difference in their lives. And ultimately, if people didn't like the idea of the government approving this bridge in 1966, this wasn't just about a by-election. Of course, it helped in a local level, but there was a general election in 1966. And if the wider British public thought, hang on a second, we don't like this bribe that you've given to the people of Hull, well, people could have voted out the Wilson government, but they didn't. In fact, there was a big swing to Labour in that election. And so I think we need to put more faith in listening to what the British public want public money spent on, rather than on green books and BCRs and technical calculations by civil servants.
Well, that's all for this midweek podcast. If you enjoy listening to Since Attlee and Churchill, and perhaps especially episodes this week, which don't use the words Makerfield or Burnham, not many podcasts that won't be doing that, then we'd be really grateful if you left us a review wherever you get your podcasts from. If you'd like to support the podcast and hear more from us, you can join our Patreon. There's a link for that in the show notes, and you'll find there ad-free listening and also bonus episodes too. And on Sunday, we'll be back with one of our main episodes, in which we're continuing our mini-series on Cameron's referendums, building up to the 10-year anniversary of the Brexit vote, but this time looking at the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.